I'm just delighted to be here. Life is better lived live, and I'm just really so happy to be in the same room with all of you. You know, Jim is exactly right. If this were 2019 or earlier, I would have come in with a triumphalist speech about the amazing renaissance of America's cities since the 1970s, of the economic comeback that cities like Boston have experienced, of the incredible ways in which cities have surged as places of creativity, as places of pleasure, as well as productivity. And then all of a sudden, COVID-19 happened. And if cities are defined as the absence of physical space between people, then the social distancing that we've all experienced over the last 18 months was, in a sense, the rapid-fire de-urbanizing of our world, right? And we all lived through it. And in some sense, we had lived through a blessed century. I mean, it's been 100 years since our last pandemic on this scale, and we sort of all forgot that this could ever happen. But pandemic is an old companion of our urban life. There are many demons that come with density: crime, contagious disease, traffic congestion, high housing prices. But the worst of these is pandemic. And the place where we start this book is in the plague of Athens, 430 BC. The backstory for that, of course, is that 5th century Athens does everything that you could ask a city to do. Right? It is this hub of the Mediterranean world. It is this place in which it seems like there's a genius, talking on every street corner. And together, these collaborative creators give us Athenian philosophy, they give us architecture, they give us sculpture, they give us democracy itself, they give us amazing drama, they give us something to aspire to this day. Yet all that success, military and economic as well as cultural, incites the rivalry of their more land-bound, rural competitor, Sparta, right? Who demands that Athens step down, right? Pericles, the master of the democracy at that point in time, refuses, and so the Peloponnesian War is on. Right? Now, Pericles has a cunning plan, which is to summon the Athenians and their allies behind the walls of the city, and then send out the superior Athenian fleet to harass the Peloponnesian coast. Militarily, the plan works. The Spartan hoplites are prevented from getting into the walls. But a wall that keeps out warriors may not prevent a virus or bacteria from coming in. And so that is exactly what happened. Through the port of Piraeus, plague enters. Thucydides, one of the two fathers of history, was there. And he describes a city gone amok, right? Social chaos that follows as roughly 1 in 4 Athenians dies over a 2-year period. Right? The people start living for today because they think there's going to be no tomorrow. And in some sense, the Athens that comes out of the plague is a shadow of its former self. It soldiers on for another 25 years before finally losing the Peloponnesian War. And it stops being the mega city of the world and becomes sort of a second-tier academic town. Maybe perhaps a Cambridge, Mass, instead of a Boston. But that's not the most terrible of the stories, right? So if we think about, we had about 500 years after that in which plague was relatively quiescent, and Rome grew on a healthy climate. And then in the 2nd century, we have a plague reappear, the Antonine Plague, and then the 3rd century we have the Cyprian Plague, which is even more catastrophic and sort of starts destabilizing the Roman Empire. But the real killer is the plague that came to Constantinople in 541 CE. Now, the backstory for that is that Rome's fallen, conquered by Ostrogoths, right? Theodoric the Great is dead. 2 generations have passed, and his sort of mediocre grandchildren have taken over, right? The Eastern Roman Empire remains. The Emperor Justinian is strong, right? And he prepares to reconquer Rome, to bring peace back to the Mediterranean, to reimpose the Pax Romana, to reimpose learning and urban civilization. And Belisarius sends out, he conquers North Africa, he conquers much of Italy, and just at that moment, Yersinia pestis itself, the Black Death, makes its first appearance on European shores, right? Completely destabilizes this conquest. It reappears decade after decade, century after century, sending Europe, right, into the chaos of 8 centuries of dark ages, 8 centuries of medieval Europe. Warfare, agricultural poverty. And this is the worst case. Now, of course, it was so catastrophic because Europe already teetered on the edge of a knife. And in some sense, the impact of a natural disaster, and I will turn to that because it's so relevant today, right? The impact of natural disaster is very much mediated by the strength of civil society. And when the terrorists bombed the Twin Towers in 9/11, our urban civilization seemed very strong, right? We seemed very united in a pragmatic consensus that had emerged after the 1970s. We don't seem quite so strong to me today. Now, flash forward 600 odd years after that, right? After the plagues, those plagues end in 1350s. Black Death reappears again, devastating population-wise, but not so devastating to the civilization that emerges. In the 19th century, plagues made repeated appearances in cities like Boston. In the early 19th century, it was about yellow fever. In the mid-19th century, it was about cholera, which emerges in the Ganges Delta in 1817. Now, our cities thrived and survived those plagues because of effective responses of civil society. This was about, sewers. This was about aqueducts. This was about smart legislation. And really, this, in some sense, the 19th century cities, which is the story that we tell in chapter 3 here, is, in some sense, a hinge of history. Because if you think about it, pretty much prior to 1800, governments were almost exclusively agents of death. It's what they did. They killed people. They may be your agents of death, so you like them, but they were still fundamentally in the business of killing other people. Then all of a sudden in the 19th century, mostly through urban infrastructure, governments started to save lives. It wasn't cheap. America's cities and towns were spending as much on clean water and sewers at the start of the 20th century as our federal government was spending on everything except for the post office and the army. Right? It wasn't easy. It required civic coalitions. It required paying attention over years and in some cases over decades to get the infrastructure built. It required incentives as well as infrastructure, right? For 25 years after the Croton Aqueduct is built, New York continues to have cholera epidemics because, in fact, the poor people in New York aren't connected to the water system. It's not until you have a health authority that starts imposing fines on tenement owners that you actually connect them to the water system. I'm saying this now because later when I talk about how awful regulations that stymie entrepreneurs are and how awful regulations that stymie our businesses are, you recognize that at least there's some regulations that I like regulations that force people to connect to the sewers. Okay. And so as this process happened, cities became healthier, they expanded enormously, and for a lucky century, we've been relatively pandemic-free. And then all of a sudden, this thing happened. And it started off as a very urban pandemic, right? Because just like classical Athens, cities are the nodes on our lattice of global travel and trade. They are the ports of entry for goods, for people, for ideas, for viruses. Right? And that's exactly what happened in this case. And so it comes into Boston, it comes into New York, and it spreads and it radiates. But unlike a waterborne disease like cholera, right, there's no airborne diseases go everywhere. And so while April, the urban centers of the Northeast were the hotspots, by November of 2020, it was all over the Dakotas, right? Because these things can go everywhere. It was particularly virulent in the informal settlements of the developing world early on, right? Because whereas in a city like Boston, even if you're living in an apartment, you're basically cut off. There's no being cut off in a slum in Mumbai or in a favela, right? You're always amidst a mass of humanity. The remarkable serological work of Anoop Malani at the University of Chicago, this is blood work that he was doing in July of 2020, right, more than a year ago, found that more than 50% of the residents of Mumbai slums had had COVID already by that date. Very few of them had actually died because they were thin and they were young and they didn't have the comorbidities. But it was rampant. Similarly, very high rates of infection in the favelas of Brazil early on. I'm not going to talk very much about chapters 4 and 5 in the book. These are the healthcare chapters. Chapter 4 is entitled, the original working title was, How is it that we spend $4 trillion a year in healthcare and end up with this mess, right? This is, and it's my co-author, David Cutler, is a health economist. And so, I urge you to read through it. I mean, our short story here is that we designed a system that was meant to spend money and to insure people against, having to pay for procedures, right? It was designed by a bunch of Southern Democrats like Wilbur Mills and Lyndon Johnson, and it was designed with their views in mind, which is they would loved Washington to pay for stuff, but they didn't like any control over anything. And that's exactly what you got, an uncontrolled spending system, right? Not one that is in any sense dedicated towards actually preserving health or delivering value per dollar. The fifth chapter is about how so many of our bodies ended up being so weak in the face of this, about obesity and other related illnesses. Chapter 6, however, focuses on the economic side again. And in some sense, this was a remarkable economic event as well as a health event. This is not usual in pandemics. This is a new thing in the world. And it would have been a much worse economic event if we had not spent trillions of dollars on things like the Paycheck Protection Program. Now, that is not saying that I think the Paycheck Protection Program was good, but whatever the economic consequences of this, they were highly muted in terms of the way they were experienced because of the flood of federal spending that occurred. The Black Death was a human tragedy, but it left the people who survived richer. Because in an agricultural society, wealth is fundamentally determined by the amount of land per capita. And so if a third of the population dies, the people who remain have 50% more land per capita left. And so wages rose dramatically after the Black Death. In fact, the demand for luxury goods that followed helped fuel the urban renaissance of the 15th century. Right? The industrial age co-occurred with the influenza pandemic. That was a short, sharp recession. Right? Factories closed, mines shut down temporarily because people got sick. But people didn't stop buying ice boxes or cars or Model Ts because they were afraid of getting the disease from the car. Right? The demand for industrial products continued, as indeed the demand for durable goods has been great during the pandemic. Right? It's been a great period for durable goods manufacturing in the US during our era. But over the last century, work has evolved. And as the factories have closed and have outsourced, as the jobs have vanished across the sea, the ability to serve a latte or perhaps a cocktail with a smile has been an employment safe haven for those Americans who don't have an advanced degree from MIT, right? And so we've seen this great urban hospitality sector, right? The leisure, hospitality, retail trade, the great urban face-to-face service economy, which contains roughly 32 million Americans working at 1/5 of the total employed labor force as of 2019, right? This is a maximally vulnerable sector when a pandemic turns that smile into a source of peril rather than a source of pleasure. And that's exactly what happened. You know, when I was working on this with my co-authors, we were doing these surveys of small businesses in the early months of the pandemic. And 45% of the small businesses in our sample were closed down. In some sectors, it was 70%, 80% had shut down. And until the trillions of dollars got spent. And I remember when like an $800 billion stimulus seemed like big money. Now all of a sudden that's nothing like that. But in enormous Armageddon, precisely because we were so vulnerable. And that economic shock, was devastating, and it was it was experienced very unevenly by the American population. So many of us were able to work remotely perfectly well. Maybe it was a little bit less fun, but we continued to keep our jobs. But other Americans either had a choice of facing the illness or losing their job. This explains an interesting fact, which is if you look in New York, I don't have the data for Boston, but if you look in New York in terms of the patterns of COVID, let's say by June 2020, sort of early on, which is when I did my research on this, what's interesting is the densest parts of the city had by far the least levels of the disease. So the highest levels of the disease were in the Bronx, even the North Bronx, were in Staten Island, and were out of Queens. The reason for this was really clear from the data. From the cell phone data. We have a measure because of the cell phone data made available by SafeCraft. We know about mobility during this pandemic in a way that we've never known before. And what you really saw was that the high density parts of New York, Manhattan, the downtown Manhattan, they shrunk their mobility basically to zero. Right? The people in the outer boroughs didn't. There was much less. Okay? And the reason was not that the Manhattanites were smarter. The reason is they were luckier. Right? They didn't have to go to their jobs in hospitals as hospitals aides or go to CVS's or go to other areas. Our estimates is that a 10% reduction in mobility during those months was associated with a 20% reduction in the levels of illnesses. So really a very striking difference that went on from that. And so this has left many people, thinking, many people of those of us who are on the lucky side of the divide, maybe we'll never go back to the office. And in a sense, that's the second shock that cities have faced, that there is a rise of remote work, which seems like it is also sort of a double existential threat to cities that are going on at the same time. Now, luckily, I had thought about this topic, about whether or not electronics would make face-to-face contact in the cities that enable that contact obsolete a few times before in my life. In fact, I have probably been writing on this topic since 1992. Okay, and I've been thinking about it probably since I read Alvin Toffler's The Third Wave in high school. So Toffler, who was the great futurist of his age, right, predicted that the rise of electronic technology would make, offices obsolete, and cities like Boston and New York would turn into forests of empty skyscrapers. Right? This was in 1980, and it was understandable that he was writing this. Right? He was coming off a decade in which a revolution in transportation technology for goods, highways, right, container ships, had caused the absolute death of the older urban industries. In New York, it would have been the garment sector, which was the largest industrial cluster in the United States in the 1950s, slaughtered by globalization. And so during this centrifugal age, right, during this age in which it looked like technology was killing off cities, it was incredibly natural for him to think that, well, this means that, in fact, these new technologies, fax machines, computers, they're just going to mean the end of urban face-to-face industries as well. We're not going to have finance in cities. We're not going to have anything. Now, for 40 years, he was completely and totally wrong, okay? Because while there's a simple logic that says that you can do more things from a long distance, what he missed is that what a more technological age meant was an age in which the returns to being smart went radically up. The returns to innovation meant radically up. And we are a social species that gets smart by being around other smart people. When you think about what happened in financial services in New York, I mean, what's your sort of image of financial services at its heart? Something like a trading floor, right? What is a trading floor? You have some of the wealthiest people on the planet who are right on top of each other, right? Why are they there? Why are they putting up with all that crowding? Because in their industry, knowledge is more important than space. Because it's an industry in which knowing a little bit more, right, can make you incredibly rich overnight. So it really pays to be in this hyper-dense, information-rich context. And so that's why, Jamie Dimon was calling for people to get back on the trading floor in October of 2020, right? This was one of the first places that people wanted to get back, right? If technology was making face-to-face contact obsolete, then why is it that the Google bought the Googleplex? Why is it they've bought millions and millions of square feet in downtown Manhattan when they, of all companies, should be able to send people remote? That was the last thing they were doing, because they recognized that creativity and innovation comes from connectivity. And the more complex the world is, the more complex ideas are, the more important it is to be face-to-face. The hard part about teaching, is not knowing your subject material. It's knowing whether or not anything you're saying is getting through to your students. Anything, right? And we have these wonderful cues for communicating comprehension or confusion that are lost when we're not in the same room with one another or when we're all behind masks, right? Which also makes things harder. Now, flash forward to this pandemic. So we've all experienced this. Many of us have been surprised about how functional it has been. But in many ways, we have sort of a bunch of clues about what's happened. So, for example, there was a great paper by the Stanford economist Nick Bloom and his co-authors looking at, this is long pre-pandemic, looking at call center workers in China. It was a randomized controlled trial. And what he finds is that when you send the call center workers home, in the short run, they become more productive. But their chance of being promoted drops by about half. Our former students, Natalia, Emanuel, and Emma Harrington, look at a major retailer in the US, both before the pandemic and during the pandemic. They find a similar thing. Call center work you can do from home. It doesn't really hurt anything. But again, the probability of being promoted to an upper center call center worker drops from 23% to 10%. Okay, so more than a 50% drop. So what's going on here? Well, what does being promoted a call center worker mean? It means you get to handle the difficult calls, right? It means you get, the real pain in the tuchus from, from somewhere. And how would you learn how to handle those calls if you were all by yourself? Who would you imitate? Who would you borrow knowledge from? How would your boss know that you were any good at these things, right? It's the face-to-face contact that creates the sort of rich information flows that enable people to learn. It's what the great English economist Alfred Marshall was talking about 130 years ago when he wrote that in dense clusters, the mysteries of the trade become no mystery, but are, as it were, in the air. Okay? Similarly, we've seen in the data sort of this huge decline in new hires for jobs that can be done remotely. So the work of Carlos Daboin and Jose Ramon Morales-Heria shows that if you could divide occupations into those jobs that can be done remotely and those jobs that must be done face-to-face. During the early days of the pandemic, the jobs that had to be done face-to-face, they plummeted. Employment plummeted, new postings plummeted. But by the summer of 2020, both of them were back. Postings were back, employment was back. The remotable jobs, the privileged occupations, employment, rock steady. Rock steady, you didn't fire people. Okay, new postings, down 40%, and it stayed down. not for 6 months, not for a year, but until, in fact, late in the spring, you finally saw late in last spring, you finally saw a tick up in it, right? Microsoft says that its programmers are just as productive looking from home, but if you look at online postings for computer programmers, they were down 40% between February and November because people weren't hiring people that they didn't see, that they couldn't onboard, they couldn't build into the culture, right? And so this is, again, a sense in which you can't build the relationships the same way remotely that you can face-to-face. You can't build someone into your organization. You can't teach them in the same way. And, of course, the evidence on classroom teaching, which is not the same thing as teaching on the job, right? But that has been an unmitigated disaster, right? And we have incredibly good high-level randomized controlled trial evidence that suggests that basically online teaching for the average student is as good as nothing, right? That's basically what it's equivalent to. So I am not arguing, and oh yes, the last major point from the data is, online life is something that is a very privileged part of the sector of the population. If you take May 2020, which was the height of remote work in the U.S., 50 million Americans were working remotely. If the share of Americans who had an advanced degree were working remotely, 68.9%. The share of Americans who are high school dropouts who were working remotely, 5%. 95% of them were not. Okay? Share of Americans with just a high school diploma, 15% only. Right? This was not something that ordinary Americans were doing. It was something that a very lucky sliver were. And so if you imagine a world that we filled by predominantly remote people going forward, you would imagine an America that is vastly more unequal than the America that we have lived through. Now, that does not mean that I don't think the remote work thing is major. I think that hybrid will be part of things. I think that there's likely to be a significant decline in the demand for commercial space because of this. Now, in Boston, that seems to be completely reversed by the unbelievable boost in demand for lab space, which appears that there's no residential building that can't be converted into a lab, apparently, in this place. So I'm not predicting doom and gloom for us, but for other areas, there's a real chance of significant declines in commercial real estate once we get back to normal on this. But in the high-end cities, the coast, that'll be dropping prices, not vacancies in the long run, right? Except, of course, for ground floor retail, which has been in problems for 10 years. So that's an enduring issue. In places like Buffalo or Detroit or Cleveland that started, with $20 a square foot rents beforehand, those places vacancies could occur. And the terrible thing is vacancies will spread because it'll cause a demand for local services. Now, even in Boston, this is an issue for us. And so my view is I can't imagine our, smart, hungry tech startup outside of Kendall Square that says, oh, you know what? Let's just all dial it in from our homes in Framingham. That sounds great for us. We're just going to go and maybe we'll, go and occasionally meet up at some suburban strip mall. This sounds like so far from what I imagine happening. But what could happen is they say, oh, we all like skiing. Let's relocate to Vail. We'll have an office. We'll still meet face to face. But we can meet with our VCs via Zoom. Why can't we do that? We can keep our existing relationships with people via Zoom. Or, we like surfing. We'll go to Honolulu. Or, you know what? You know what we really don't like? Paying taxes. Let's go to Texas. Okay? So, there are all these options. And in some sense, talent has never become more mobile. And the fear that I have is that, in fact, we face a replay of the 1970s, when you had a collision of progressive dreams for cities to do far more for their less advantaged, colliding with the reality that the taxpayers, that the tax base, that both the companies and the wealthy citizens found it easier than ever to relocate. In the 70s, it was about highways, it was about suburbs, it was about factories that could be moved away. In the 2020s, it's about Zoom. It's about electronic technology. And that collision can be dangerous. Now, we have to understand why it is this progressive hunger comes from something real. It comes from the ways in which this pragmatic consensus has fallen apart over the last 20 years. And I focus on, this is chapters 8 and 9 of the book, and we focus on really three things. We focus on housing, we focus on education, and we focus on cops and policing. And in all cases, the sort of running narrative is one that's borrowed from Manker Olson 40 years ago in Rise and Decline of Nations, where he sort of depicted that a society that was stable would gradually be taken over by its insiders, who would figure out how to work the system through regulations or other tricks and basically exclude outsiders. In the case of housing, we all know what this is about. This is about housing affordability, right? The reason why we're not affordable is we don't build enough. The reason why we don't build enough is that we are very highly regulated. Those are regulatory decisions that were made to protect insiders, right, to protect everybody's views. They were made with no cost-benefit analysis, no serious way of appraising anything, and they make this city and so many cities affordable, exclusively to the wealthy. I tell this story in the form of an LA story around the battle for Boyle Heights, which is a gentrification battle between Latino longtime residents and hipster gentrifiers. And the point that we try to make is that it's seen as being a battle between those two, but they actually are the same. They're just outsiders who are battling over a limited scrap of land. The real enemies are the regulators who are stopping the construction that could provide plenty of space. Los Angeles County is not all that dense. You can provide plenty of space for both groups to coexist without fighting each other over the same space. And this is one problem, right? A second and even deeper problem is opportunity, right? Is the fact that our cities are great for upward mobility for adults, and they are terrible for our children, right? And we've seen this in the Opportunity Atlas data that my colleague Raj Chetty and his co-authors have put together, that not only are dense metropolitan areas worse than less dense metropolitan areas, dense neighborhoods are worse than less dense neighborhoods within, and this is all data on the cohort that was born between 78 and 83. It holds constant the income of their parents, and it looks at how they're doing 40 years later or 35 years later as adults in terms of income distribution. There's a very significant break, it won't surprise you, right at the edge of the central city school districts on average. So typically you go up about 3 percentiles in the income distribution if you live right outside the central city school district rather than right inside it. And you have about a 1/3 or 1 percentage point lower chance of being incarcerated as an adult if you grow up right outside the central city school district. Now my discussion of this gives me a chance to talk a little bit about school reform efforts, okay? And I talk about the federal attempts to sort of remake schooling. And this gave me a chance to revisit some fun times that Jim and I had 10 years ago, where he was on the right side and I was on the wrong side. So that gave me a lot of fun to do that. But in fact, I was on the board of the advisory panel of the Gates Foundation for many years. And I think I was foolishly optimistic that something like Race to the Top could be helpful. Right? That in fact, the federal government could do something to try and encourage our school systems to do something well. I have now decided 10 years later that was just a complete fool's errand, that this was an absolutely, that the ability to do these reforms is very, very high. So I do both, talking about Race to the Top and its sort of botched implementation, including, the flaw, and, this Jim was so right about, that, the crucial thing in education is we have to learn before we implement. We have to have the humility to learn. It's also sort of the key to fighting pandemic, by the way. The idea that Gates embraced Common Core without any degree of clear scientific understanding that this was going to be productive for any was a huge mistake. And I will say inside that I always argued for having more evidence on this stuff, but it was moved first, and Jim was right to emphasize that. And I also talk about the Michelle Reeve thing. In both the cases of crime in schools, I take one managerial failure and one regulatory legal failure. Our story, our proposal is we still want the feds to be involved, but I've just given up on the school districts. And so I think this jives basically with the vocational training. We're sort of proposing doing more experimental work on wraparound, after school, weekends, vocational training programs, right? And part of the advantage of these is you can competitively source and you can pay for performance, much more than you can for traditional schooling. Because traditional schooling doesn't have a clear objective, so you can't have pay for performance. If you're training a kid to learn how to program, right, if that kid knows how to program when they're done. So you can, have for-profit companies, you can have community colleges, you can have whoever you want compete, and you can, pay them only if they get paid. I'm not advancing this for all the country. I'm advancing more experimental programs that take part around our schools. We have to recognize that we don't know what works. We have to recognize that when it comes to opportunity, we need an Apollo program, not a Marshall Plan. By which I mean the Marshall Plan meant we were just going to spend a lot of money. Right? The Apollo program said, we're going to spend a lot of money, but we don't know how to get to the moon right now. Right? We're going to start first by learning how to get to the moon. And that's the opportunity side. The last side, and this is actually where I worry most about progressive dreams, pushing out skilled people, is in crime. So I take the readers back to the fight against crime in the late 1980s. And I take it back specifically to the murder of Diane Balasiotes. Diane was a lovely young woman in Seattle. She was killed by a horrendous sexual predator who should never have been on the streets. With one of these guys, it was claimed that they were felt to be too dangerous to be kept in their mental institution, so they were just left out. That was the story. So this was the 1980s, right? Crime was rampant, and America was crying for justice, and they were crying for order. And so we got, significant amounts of increases in cops in many of our cities. We got an increase in in penalties. Diane's mother, Ida Ballestiotis, became a political figure and led the crusade for 3 strikes and you're out. Now, her righteous rage is completely understandable, as was a New York that wanted a Ray Kelly to implement stop and frisk. But the truth of the matter is, we did win this battle against crime in cities like Boston, New York. But in many cities, I think not so much in Boston. I actually have long viewed Ed Davis as a hero. And in fact, I think that Boston's tradition in policing has a lot to be proud of. But there's no question that every kid of whatever color deserves to be treated with a certain amount of decency and respect by the police. Right? We need to have a dual mandate for cops, which is something that Ed Davis would embrace. Right? There's no question that Ed Davis believes strongly that his police should be respectful of everyone. Right? And I have in my my Harvard X course called Cities X, I do some interviews with Ed where he has these wonderful stories about how he gets police to understand how to work with the community. And so in the policing side, right, we need to be smarter. We need to be smarter about punishment. So we should lock up and throw away the key, the kind of person who killed Diane Ballestiotis, but that does not mean that every 3-time marijuana dealer needs to be locked up for life. Right? We need to have a system that's smart enough to distinguish between one type of person and the other. And when it comes to cops, we need to recognize that some cities really do need reform. They need a dual mandate, which is both to keep our cities safe and to treat people with respect. But that is so far away from defunding the police, which is about the most idiotic slogan I could possibly imagine. Right? We don't want our police to do less. We want our police to do more. And if you want more out of something, there's no free lunch here. Right? You need to both pay more and you need to put managerial things in place. And I think you need hard metrics for whatever it is you're trying to get in terms of decency and respect that actually make this happen. So there is a path forward, but it's certainly not a stupid one like defunding the police. Moreover, the idea that you're going to take cops out of all but the most confrontational things, that's sure to turn cops into gladiators. That's the last of what Ed Davis would tell you want to do. You want your cops to actually interact with people on a normal, ordinary, even banal basis. Right? You want them just to engage in the ordinary currency of life. And this builds the skill of working together with the community. That, again, requires more resources, not less. So as we look forward, right, the critical thing is that talent has become mobile, and there's a hunger to make our cities, feel more inclusive. And that's an understandable hunger. And I believe that's something that we should embrace. But the right tools to do this are not sort of, shut down the police, tax the rich, regulate the hell out of things. The right thing is to create a city that is once again a city for outsiders. Right? That's a city that has, regulations that enable you to build, that don't prevent things. That's a city that has education programs that are smart, that are competitive. It's a shame that we put the cap on charter schools that we did, right? We need to have more competition in lots of areas, and we need to have more entrepreneurship. It is an outrage in this country that we regulate the entrepreneurship of the poor so much more than we regulate the entrepreneurship of the rich. Right? That if you want to start your internet phenomenon in your Harvard College dorm room, there's not a regulator looking over your shoulder until you have 1 billion users and have, possibly influence an election. If you want to start your grocery store in Alston that sells milk products, you need at least 15 permits. Okay? That is an outrage. And the right answer is not to replace protection for one set of insiders, right? Homeowners, existing businesses, with protections for another set of insiders. Oh, let's make sure we forgive college debt for children of wealthy parents, right? This makes absolutely no sense, right? What we need is a genuine, a genuine level playing field that tears down some of the unnecessary regulations and creates the freedom to flourish. And so we need a more effective government. We need particularly, and again, I'm not talking very much about this, but I will say we have a whole proposal for a NATO for health, which actually, if someone wants to ask me about the questions, I will do my best to channel my co-author on. But we need also a government that is limited in sensible ways. Now, this is certainly a less triumphalist book than my last one. But let me say that I think the track record of the past 3,000 years in our cities is miraculous. I think the tendency of human beings to work together, to learn from each other, to create things together, to buy, to sell, to meet, to befriend, I think that is just an absolutely miraculous thing. And when I look around the world, I am completely confident that the age of urban miracles is not over. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. So I went on a little long. I got excited about the police. It was all the Ed Davis stuff. Okay, who's got a question? Yes, sir.
I'm going to probably make a mistake by going global here, but the Wall Street Journal, which would be the last publication you would think would publish something by George Soros, has published 2 pieces, very strong pieces, that are anti-China by George Soros recently, and I presume you've read those. I'd just like you to talk about the China challenge briefly.
So I am certainly not an expert on foreign affairs, and one of the key things is to not have opinions on things that are not in your key bailiwick. I will, however, happily tell you about the Chinese real estate bubble, on which in fact I am in fact something of an expert, as I have published on that. And what China has done over the past 15 years is built vastly more housing than they have any demand for at this current level of income. Right? So there are, in fact, vast towers of empty skyscrapers. The basic model for this is you have urban development corporations that are very cozy with local governments. I remember, I'm not going to tell that story. I'm being taped here, okay? I'm not going to tell the story. But once I'm off tape, I'll tell you the story. But I have to be off record on that. But very, very cozy relationships, and they build vast amounts. This boosts the local GDP, which is exactly what the mayors want to have happen. Then they're not able to sell the apartments, but you don't have to sell the apartments to count them for GDP. You just have to make them, right? So they can stand empty. Now, in the U.S., you'd have a creditor who would say, you got to sell the apartments. But there, the creditor, that's a public bank. That's a government bank, so the mayor can lean on them too, and so you have essentially these zombie development companies that are building, that have these massive amounts of building, and the building has continued. And this is now a huge fraction of China's GDP, and it's not sustainable by any metric. So how China works its way out of this is going to be very, very difficult, right? They have a whole bunch of less skilled workers who are in construction. Part of their push for infrastructure is part of an attempt to, so when you hear talk about utterly insane things like high-speed rail between Beijing and Europe, which is about the craziest and stupidest idea I've heard. There's this thing called flying, which is actually the right technology for moving people from China to Europe. And you don't use high-speed rail to move goods. It's not an appropriate transport topic for freight. So it's going to be very, very hard for them to figure out how to reallocate those urban workers to avoid sort of the political risks that large-scale unemployment creates, and create some form of employment for them if they let the construction sector down. But if they don't, we're just going to continue to have more and more oceans of empty skyscrapers. So that's, from my world, that's what I see Xi Jinping facing. So I'm not going to say more in terms of the U.S. relationship with China, because that's just out of my world. Yes.
I want to thank you for your talk, and I admire your work. I read your things and think that your attention to actual data is really important and somewhat rare. One of the things I wonder about is a general question, having lived in Boston for many years and being a big Cato fan, reading things like Randall O'Toole, who says, cities are a disaster because of the things that happen in Boston. You build anything, and it's a wonderful place, but you try to do anything here, it is impossible. So you alluded to the fact that we should get rid of this or that, but Randall O'Toole is correct. This place will never get rid of 15 requirements for changing my front porch on my 10-story condominium, and so it's very heartening. I think you have a lot of great ideas, but in Boston and other places where there's this sclerotic grasp of controls, it will never be a free and open place.
There will always be limitations, but progress still can be made. I mean, I remember the first conversation I had with Tom Menino about building heights in 2003. And I got the gruffest, no, Boston will never be New York. We don't want to build any more tall buildings. This is a disaster, right? And it took a bunch of years, and there were a lot of us who were pushing it. But eventually we got this, the city built this thing on the seafront, the Innovation District, and there's at least some release. Marty Walsh was generally pretty pro-height. Now, it's still regulated. I mean, he came out of the building trade, so we I think understand why he saw the value of those jobs, and he saw the value of the economic activity that the building created, and that was great. So I think progress is doable, but American cities, all developed cities, move very slowly. But I can't see giving up on them, right? I mean, it is true that for much of the past 5 years, before the pandemic hit, I was doing most of my work in cities in the developing world. Partially because the political situation, the regulatory situation is just much more fluid. It's just much easier to get Cape Town to move than it is to get Boston to move. There's still so much that is good here, and there's so much that is worth fighting for here, that that I can't see giving up on it. But it's exactly that attitude that we're never going to change it. It's always going to be bad, so let's leave. That in fact I'm frightened of right now, because it's never been easier to leave. And in fact, if what happens after the next election is we get a city that basically thinks that crime rates are going to go up, we're going to become more regulatory, and we're going to do our best to sort of tax our the largest contributors to our economy, then a lot of people are going to think about leaving. And it is this is the script that we lived through. The script of my childhood in New York in the 70s. So thank you. That's further questions. Yes, sir.
What do you think is the effect for cities and urban areas where we have such a polarized socio-political atmosphere, where two sides can't even agree on some basic facts of reality, and cities, urban areas are basically all associated with one side, let's say the blue side, division against much of the rest of the country. What effects can that possibly have in the next few decades going forward?
It's bad. Bad. It's bad. I grew up in New York City as a Republican. I thought it was a good thing to be a Republican in New York. And I still do think it's a good thing to be a Republican in New York or Boston. It's a good thing to have two parties. It's a good thing to have political competition and so forth. I mean, it hasn't, the national political spectrum is so difficult right now. It's very hard to sort of make things work. I don't have a recipe for that. But I do know that I think at least the right place to start is on trying to solve concrete problems. That in fact, for most concrete problems, there's no Republican or Democratic way to fix a pothole or clean up the street, as the old saying goes. And so the more that we're focused on real things that need to get fixed, how are we going to deliver both, lock up fewer people, make sure that young men are treated with respect, but we're going to keep the crime rates low. We've got to achieve all of those things. So that's our objective. We've got to figure out how to better educate our kids. That's our objective, right? It's not a Republican objective. It's not a Democratic objective. Everybody wants opportunity for our children, right? So we just got to focus on that and avoid the cultural stuff, right? So it's as much as possible, and do our best to agree to disagree on this. And that's one reason why I didn't take the bait on China, right? There's a whole set of issues in which I don't want to take an opinion on a topic where I'd lose them on congestion pricing, right? If I took this topic, I think that's sort of an important thing to sort of focus ourselves on a narrow set of issues which are largely pragmatic about helping this city and helping the country to run. So thank you. Yes, sir.
First, I really appreciate your high baud rate delivery. It's really nice to hear. One of the questions I have to ask is, why should I stay? The time constant for change here is measured in decades. I live in a town in which we've tried to put a rail trail in. We're having success on that, but it takes 25 years to do that.
You live in Weston?
Okay, but you see this and you say, gee, if I want to live in a town that has a rail trail, the real strategy is to move. The smart strategy. So my question here is for Boston, why should I stay?
It's a question that should be asked loudly, and whoever the next mayor has to understand there are a lot of people who pay taxes in this area who are asking that question. And if the mayor isn't focused on delivering value to those people, that they will go, right? That's, I think, the most, I'm not going to try and convince you to stay. I wrote my last book about what cities are good. I'm not trying, now I'm trying to write a book in which I'm trying to get the next mayor, whoever it is, to be focused on, actually, you cannot treat your taxpayers as a golden goose that can be just milked, right? I think much of the action on the regulatory side is likely to work through the State House. So, California has a real live. California has a real live, regulatory movement on housing. Massachusetts, we did have action before the last housing bust that was pretty small around the edges, but the State House is where you can change the local ability to regulate the heck out of everything. So one target is the mayor. A second target is the legislators, and trying to push for something that limits the local straitjacket, either for regulation of businesses or for regulation of builders. But I'm not trying to convince you to stay. I'm in fact eager for you to get out that megaphone and yell that right at Government Center that I'm leaving right now, I'm leaving. So thank you for your question. Anything else? Yes, Tom.
Well, we'll take you back from China to Boston. One of the big challenges, immediate challenges of cities in America, especially on the West Coast, but now here, Mass and Cass, is the homeless, mentally ill, drug addicts. It's a crisis at Mass and Cass now. The long-term solution is something we could debate forever. Do you have anything that the state and the city should do immediately to alleviate this crisis?
We don't touch on homelessness. I don't know. I mean, LA's homelessness problem is much worse than ours. And we know the long-term solutions that we have for homelessness are incredibly expensive, right? So there's no way that our local fiscal capacity is to sort of, deliver the things that the homelessness advocates want them to do. So, oddly, I began this morning giving a book talk at the LSE at 7:30 a.m. and this topic came up, and this is one of those things like, dealing with water-related risk for low-lying cities in the developing world that are just extraordinarily difficult. So homelessness, I'm not a homelessness expert. I'm not going to, the things that people, there's a fixed housing first school of this, which sort of thinks the goal is to get them into housing immediately. There's a school that says that in fact you need to get behavioral change beforehand, but we know that it's a very difficult problem. It's a problem where the advocates want an amount of spending per person that is wildly at odds with what voters are going to be willing to pay, right? Because this is not, 13-year-olds are a sympathetic audience, right? You want hope and second chances for them, right? 40-year-olds who have been on the street for 15 years saying, we want to, make sure we're paying for them forever to get them off the streets, that is a very tough sell to voters. And so I don't have a solution to that. I wish I did. And I don't think there's an obvious silver bullet, but.
Any last question?
Was one over there? Yes, sir.
Like you were saying, like a lot of cities were throughout the 20th century, cities were being built, and they hadn't arguably seen something like the pandemic. We have something that big, and like a lot of college students now, since this pandemic has happened, they're told to stay away from the city, stay away from what were these business hotspots. How do you think the city, because we haven't seen something like this, how do you think the city's gonna recover from that? Not just Boston, but cities across the country, with all this stuff moving online, moving away from the urban areas due to the pandemic. Do you think we're going to see that get back to the point where it was, or do you think it's going to be more of a compromise between city, business, and
Look, that is just not a group that I am worried about. Yes. I have 3 teenage children myself. I have watched them live a virtual life over the past 18 months, and it has not been at all a great thing. In fact, my primary health worry during the pandemic was not the disease; it was that one of my teenage children would kill me. That was my primary anxiety. The truth of the matter is the desire to be around other young single people really live is sufficiently strong and sufficiently biologically hardwired, and that's what cities deliver. So that power, I will bet on that forever. And for that reason, I am very confident that a generation that has temporarily been pulled away from cities will figure out that there are fun things happening downtown, and they want to be part of that. So I'm happy to end on that one, and thank you all for your questions.
That is a fitting first event after 18 months not seeing. This is tremendous. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Pleasure.
Could not have asked for more. And thank you for taking some additional time with us and doing that. That's really great. Listen, there's some books here. There's some pens here. There's Ed here.
There's a chair that moves.
What do you want to drink?
Another seltzer would be great.
Yep. So look forward to seeing those who can make it next week. If not, look for more events later on this year. Thank you very much for coming. Thanks, Ed.